this debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's an honour for me to stand in this House today to not only pledge my support to Bill C-49, but also to give my own personal story in relation to my passion for history and why I totally agree with the vision and applaud our Minister and his able Parliamentary Secretary for bringing this bill before this House and debating it here tonight. This bill is known best as the bill that is establishing the Canadian Museum of History. And really, this is not recreating or re-establishing an important national museum. In many ways, it's actually reasserting its important mandate as a national institution in Canada, but also extending that national mandate to all the small towns, villages, and cities across this great nation. History does not just belong in the nation's capital, but indeed it belongs across the country, Mr. Speaker. And in many ways, this bill is almost one of the last crown jewels in the collection of important national museums that our government has supported across Canada. Going back to our support in 2008 for the Canadian Museum of Human Rights being established in Winnipeg, and indeed in 2010 to our government's reassertion of the importance of Pier 21 as Canada's National Museum of Immigration in Halifax. And Mr. Speaker, I had the good fortune of visiting Pier 21 in its early years, thanks to the vision of the Goldblums in Halifax that brought that important institution to our country. And even more so, the day after my wedding in Halifax, Mr. Speaker, my wife and I, dreary-eyed as we might have been with my parents, took my grandmother, Madge Hall, to Pier 21, where she first stepped into Canada with her husband and my infant mother, Molly, after World War II. Not only did we experience that museum, but we looked up the manifest for the Lusitania that they boarded to come to Canada and a tremendous new life. And I only wish one of those three people were still here to see their grandson sitting in Canada's Parliament. In many ways, this bill refocuses our National Historic Museum, but more importantly, I'll speak on why I think the national network that this museum creates is even more important than the rebranding and refocusing of the institution in Ottawa. It is indeed a travesty that 90% of our historic artifacts and treasures are in storage, Mr. Speaker. It's time to free these important artifacts from the shackles of indifference and in dust and share them with the small towns across Canada, or indeed the large museums like the ROM or the Royal Museum in British Columbia, so that they too can feel an attachment to these important artifacts. But the converse, Mr. Speaker, is perhaps even more important than getting this national artifact network established. More importantly, it's also important for museums like Scugog Shores in Port Perry, or the Clarington or Clark Museum in Clarington, or Lucy Maud Montgomery Museum in Uxbridge to share some of their local artifacts with our national institution in Ottawa. Thanks to the vision behind C-49 and our Minister of Canadian Heritage, we're going to have visitors to Canada exploring the Canadian Museum of History and seeing artifacts and the history of the small towns and villages in Durham at our national institution in Ottawa. Mr. Speaker, that is truly remarkable and important. There is going to be a dedicated permanent space to exhibits from museums, over 2,500 across this country. Mr. Speaker, in this debate, it's also an honor for me to tell my personal story a bit here tonight, and in my first year, utter only my second Winston Churchill quote. Churchill said, study history, for in history lie the secrets to statecraft." Now, my friends on this side of the House should really indeed read more history to learn those secrets, to try and take our side of the House. But the very fact you have not leaves me resting assured that we're going to maintain that side of the House because we followed the edict of one of the world's greatest parliamentarians. My love of history started, Mr. Speaker, when I was an 18-year-old officer cadet crossing the parade square at Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. We had a mandate as young gentlemen and lady cadets of the college to learn the history of that historic site. We gazed at the RMC flag, which was designed by the Dean of Arts, George Stanley, who shared his vision for the nation's flag in 1964 with John Matheson, a distinguished gunner from the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery and then the MP for Leeds. Mr. Speaker, this John Matheson is still alive and at 95 is really one of our living veterans that truly tells the history of this great country. George Stanley at RMC taught generations of historians who are with us today as leading voices. At RMC, he taught Desmond Morton, he taught Jack Granatstein. And in many ways, this debate on why Canada needs a National Museum of History was started by one of George Stanley's students, Dr. Jack Granatstein, who in 1998 wrote, "Who Killed Canadian History?" Well, in many ways, Mr. Speaker, the years since then, Canadian history has been given a new life. And in many ways, this bill is giving our National Historic Museum and network of history a life across this country. So it's my pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to rise today in full support of Bill C-49, indeed our government's answer to the question, who killed Canadian history? We may not be able to answer that, but we certainly know who is breathing new life into the subject, Mr. Speaker.